Hey, good afternoon, everyone in U.S. history, too. Apologize about my extremely informal appearance, but I have some outdoor activities I have to attend to, and this is how I usually dress. So I'm going to be comfortable, and I'm going to try to go through this chapter, which I think is it's number 24, and it's World War II, it's its origins. It's not just about, obviously, U.S. history. You have to cover some world history um, to fully understand the concepts around World War II and its impact on U.S. history. The chapter is very well written. I know these videos tend to go long, so I'm going to try to keep it nice and tight. The book does, I think, a very, very nice job. Most people want to start off, what were the causes of World War II? And they're obviously, some people think, oh, Jesus, it was, the December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor. But it's obviously a much more complex set of factors that go into it. And one of them is really the ending of World War I left something called the Versailles Peace Treaty with many flaws in it. It was so draconian against the German nation. Reparations had to be paid, demilitarization. It had the ripple effect of not only stifling the German economy, but basically the German people as well resented it quite a bit. And eventually the German government failed, largely from economics. Economics is often a linchpin to why nations can fail. And the economic crisis in Germany was no exception to that. And that gave the rise to fascism. So we have the failure of the Versailles Peace Treaty and the peace efforts that came from that, the rise of fascism. I'm just giving a list. The book goes through it a little bit better. I'm obviously looking at my notes. Then the formation of the Axis coalition. Basically, initially it was Germany, Italy, and Russia. We know Germany is going to basically become traitors to the pact, if you will, and they're going to split their two fronts to east and west, which ultimately leads to Germany's demise. But it's an important concept to why sometimes violence breaks out in the World War is sometimes because of allegiances, and that's part of the factors that go into it. And then we know the German aggression in Europe. The German aggression related to basically reunifying some of the lands and territories that they believe were rightfully theirs from the closure of World War One, but also this conception of German identity and nationalism. There were areas in Czechoslovakia, for example, in other European nations that had Germanic speaking people and were culturally Germanic, and the argument was they should be incorporated within sort of the German Empire, and that's basically how it began. First, there was a section of Czechoslovakia, then all of Czechoslovakia was basically seized by Germany. And what did the rest of the world do? Well, it was a policy of what's known as appeasement. In hindsight, appeasement becomes partially blamed for why World War II broke out. And appeasement was basically say, if this is all Hitler and Germany wants, let's let them have it. We don't want to have another World War. World War I left a very bitter taste in the world's mouth, if you will. Not only the United States, but certainly the French and England and the entire world wanted to avoid another world war. And how do you do that is basically sometimes you appease, let them take a few inches and hopefully don't take a mile. But we know that backfired because eventually they invade Poland, which leads to World War II, the actual invasion. And we're not involved in it yet. I shouldn't call it a war yet. The United States doesn't get involved until Japanese, which becomes allied with the Axis powers. We know they bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, which brings us to declare war on Japan. And then Germany and Italy, because of their allegiance to the Japanese Empire, will declare war on us. But it was probably written on the wall once France and England entered into the war against Germany that we were going to largely be allied with the Allies. We had a lot of not only economic interest in doing so, but we had a historical and cultural interest in continuing those allegiances. And a lot of people say, oh, we're going to stay out of World War II. And there was a huge movement because World War I, again, left a very bitter taste in our mouth. Stay out of those European theater wars. We shouldn't have any involvement in it whatsoever. And on paper and maybe even in policy, it seemed like we did try to stay out of the Second World War. But the reality was, and the book does not go over this part well, we were doing things like lend-lease, meaning we would not overtly sell over military ships and supplies and things like that to any of the antagonists. But nonetheless, we were certainly doing it with the Allied power, especially Great Britain. And those are some of the causes. The next one, of course, we know is the Imperial Japanese Empire was basically invading China, and we put up letters of protest and we did all these other things as a result of that. But as their expansion into China, into their control of the Chinese nation, we started basically doing an embargo, and one of them being oil. And that was so critical to the Japanese Empire that the Japanese really thought we were already antagonistic in their mindset. We've already kind of almost declared war in the 1930s against Japan because of the economic embargo. And that was a concern for those that look back at history. The recognition of the tensions between us and Japan obviously predate December 7th, 1941. It's because of the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and then later the whole continent really of that makes up China, and that was in 1937. And Manchuria was all the way back from 1931, so the tensions keep going. So I just kind of a list of causes I thought I'd start off the chapter with, but the book does a nice job of the origins of the Pacific War. And we know, again, the Japanese quickly defeated the isolated Chinese warlords. China didn't have a very organized military structure. It's very fractionalized at the time. And Japan was a war machine, and they were extremely efficient. And they quickly defeated and isolated Chinese warlords. And by the end of February 1932, all of Manchuria was under Japanese control, and we know that continues throughout the decade. And then we created what in the United States was the Simpson Doctrine. And this is 1932. We said we would fail to recognize any government within China that was basically Japanese controlled, and as a result of that, the Japanese withdrew from the League of Nations, which we weren't a member of anyways. But the tensions are there much earlier. And then a big part is that oil embargo. But we know when Japan goes and conquers the rest of China in 1937, and they took over Nanjing, there's a book written called The Rape of Nanjing. Unbelievable amount of barbarism, if you will, from the Japanese conquering the Chinese mainland. And it left a very, very high degree of tension between the United States and Japan, and really much of the rest of the world as a result of the rape of that nation. Very troubling. One of the interesting phenomena is that Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader of China, when they were withdrawing from these Chinese provinces that the Japanese were taking over, they had basically a scorched earth policy, and they would destroy anything of value that the Japanese might be able to take: bridges, dams, buildings, everything you could think of. But to a lot of the people that were living in those regions that were having to evacuate and also losing all of their possessions and their homes and their communities were lost, it embittered them to their own government. And what became more and more popular was at that juncture, a very weak communist party under Mao Zedong. But Mao Zedong, as a result really of the actions of Chiang Kai-shek and the scorched earth policy of retreat, helped bolster the communist cause in China. And we know what happened shortly after World War II, and that's the Chinese Revolution. But anyways, I'm getting way ahead of myself. That's for a later chapter, or for world history if you should take it. And Americans retreated still towards isolationism up until 1941. We retreated towards isolation, but the government was working very closely with Great Britain, especially in the Lend-Lease program, and we were certainly given financial support, armaments, and things of that nature. But the people did not want to get involved, really right up until the eve of or right up until the moment that the Japanese government did the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. 2,400 servicemen and women too were killed in that surprise attack. And the reason why the Japanese did it was they thought they were already pretty much at war with the United States anyways, and they wanted to cripple the fleet. And they said basically the only way we'd be able to beat this industrial giant of the United States was to give themselves a great deal of time, but basically cutting us out at the knees and taking out our Pacific Navy. Wasn't as nearly successful as they had hoped. Definitely had a huge impact, but it brought us into war. We declare war. The famous speech, "This day it shall live in infamy for all time." That was the request by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to seek the declaration of war against Japan. And obviously it was successful. That's the last time we ever declared war. And 3 or 4 days later, Germany declares war as a result of us declaring war in Japan, and then Italy declares war in the United States a couple days later. And now it's a world war. 1941, December 7th, it begins. I was actually engaged on December 7th, not in 1941. And part of the theory is that's so I wouldn't forget what day it would be, because it would live in infamy all the time. So the origins of the European War, we know Hitler repudiated all the punitive damages that were being brought against the German nation after the German government collapses. He becomes chancellor, largely because he's trying to create coups all the time anyways within the German government. German government finally collapses. Hitler takes over completely. He doesn't want to pay these huge reparations. He doesn't like the fact that the military can't rearm under the Versailles Treaty, and he just does that, starts creating a huge air force, navy, military, and it starts to expand rapidly. And again, the first lands taken were in Czechoslovakia. Later he's going to invade Poland, and he creates a pact, and you should know the name of it. And it's sometimes called the Molotov Pact with the Soviet Union. It was a secret deal, basically saying that when we go into Poland, we'll split it between the Soviet Union, or Russia at the time, and Germany. And Germany promises a non-aggression agreement. We won't go after you. Russia, you're safe. You don't have to worry about us, and we're going to split up this little spoil of war. And the hope was by England. England didn't do anything initially, and we didn't go in, or the English or the French didn't go in and invade to fight the German invasion of Poland. They thought Poland might hold on for maybe up to 6 months. Lasted 3 weeks. The new military of Germany was very, very mobile, very, very swift, and very, very technologically advanced for its time. And because of that, they created a concept, German term of blitzkrieg, meaning lightning fast. They were able to take over Poland in 3 weeks instead of 6 months, really rapid. And it had a stunning effect, and we still didn't enter into war. Only when just like the Schefflin plan, did Germany go in through the Netherlands and then start attacking above the reinforced lines that were in France by going above, just like the Schefflin plan recommended. France gets taken over in a very short time. Everyone thought that would last for, just like in World War I, it would be a stalemate. Not this time. There's pictures of Hitler at the Eiffel Tower. Within a handful of weeks, maybe 6 weeks, it takes Germany basically to conquer France, and that was just shocking to the world. And basically and now next is basically Hitler's plan to take over Great Britain, and that's Operation, I forgot the name of the exact operation they called it when they were going to go into Great Britain, but we know it was called the Battle of Britain, and basically it was fought in the air, and a very superior air force of Germany could not defeat the RAF, the Royal Air Force, and managed to keep Great Britain free from invasion by Germany. It forestalled that, and that's when the American forces and American industry and the rest start getting involved. And what was amazing about that was it was really, really an underdog victory. If you like underdogs, well, most of us like the Allies. We think Germany was bad, right? But we also often like underdogs, where people that are, or entities that are supposed to lose win, and they overcome unbelievable odds to do so. And that's the story of the RAF, and that's the great speech that Winston Churchill gave, and it still resonates to this day. And I'm a kind of a nerd, so occasionally I listen to old broadcasts of FDR and Churchill and people like that to give me, I don't know, motivation, or just to feel like bring me back in time to what it must have been like. In the great line, of course you're asking me to quote it now, or I'm asking myself to quote it, and I probably can't, but so much is owed to so few. For preserving Great Britain's liberty and its sovereignty. And that was about the IRF being able to keep Great Britain free in the Battle of Britain. Yeah, prompting the new Prime Minister Winston Churchill, never before in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. By the way, there's a great movie with Gary Oldman, if you want to watch it, about Churchill during World War II. But England was being bombed night and day in the city, and people would have to take their kids and often ship them off to strangers in the country in order to keep them from the nightly bombing. And nightly bombings would occur, and everyone would go down to the basement, the subways, and things like that. And they would get up in the morning and they would take care of the wounded, try to clean up and bury the dead, those that didn't survive it, and they would start all over. And some say the saying came, stay calm and carry on, and that's the British attitude during this period of time. And they really weathered an unbelievable amount of bombing during this era. But we know what the big, arguably a mistake was. Hitler during this period of time decides to launch in 1941, in June of 1941. This is before we're even in the war. Operation Barbarossa, which is the invasion of the Soviet Union, and it works great initially. And they blitzkrieging right in. I think they have three major. I'm not a military historian, but they had three major branches. They really nearly take over the entire nation. It looks really, really bad for Russia that they're going to survive this thing. But they also have a skirt George policy as they're retreating, and they get onto the doorsteps of the capital of Russia. And where did they land? Actually, I think they were actually visual. Yeah, scorched earth. They were right outside of Moscow, Stalingrad, and Leningrad, and they were right there. And what happens? Well, one is the supply lines are thousands of miles long. The German army is exhausted. They're fighting a two-front war, and winter hits. And the winters in Russia are unbelievable. And many of the men freeze, they starve, and they're exhausted. And the Russian spirit just hangs on, and they keep fighting back. And one of the reasons why people say, why did the Cold War happen after World War II, is the fear and bitterness of not having some kind of buffer between the Soviet Union and other potentially hostile nations was such a fear, because they lost so many lives during World War II, more than any other country. It was really remarkable. Let me see if I usually underline things. It says, Germany had won massive gains, but the winter found Germany exhausted and overextended. It was the Soviet Union that broke Hitler's army. 25 million Soviet soldiers and civilians, 25 million. And civilians died during the Great Patriotic War. And roughly 80% of all German casualties of war came on the Eastern Front, came in the Russian front. So it was Russia, or the aspect of Russia involved in the two-front war, that broke the Germans' back. We're not even in it yet. In December 1941, Germany tried to begin its long retreat from the Russian front, but we're not even in it yet. And then the United States enters the war, and there was there's these 3 or 4 great meetings between the United States, FDR. One of them is Truman at the end, but FDR and Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin will meet to talk about planning for it. Joseph Stalin wants them to go into, we need you to open up the Western Front to get them out of the Eastern Front, because we are just barely hanging on. And then there was other arguments that we needed to fight in the Pacific and subdue Japan, but we thought Japan, basically that was going to take second tier priority, and we were going to fight the European war first. And we know we started we did Africa, Northern Africa, and then we entered into Italy. And Italy, there was just go right up to the underbelly, as Winston Churchill would call it, into Europe. And boy, that was not easy at all. In fact, it was much more difficult, much more significant casualties, and it was much more like traditional, like World War I type, like lines of demarcation where there was very little movement between the two. It took a long time to crack Italy, and eventually, because the writing's on the wall, the Italian government finally collapses. Mussolini is executed, and the new Italian government immediately declares peace. And then, basically the Italian peninsula is captured. They're out of the war. I think they actually turn around and declare war against Germany. A little late, but nonetheless, it's always easier to pick a winning side by that point. But that doesn't really prevail in terms of ending the European war. What does is the great day called D-Day. It was actually a different name for it. I always thought it was actually entitled D-Day, but I noticed, and I've read it in other books too, and I always forget that. about what the mission was. Yeah, it's Operation Overlord, and Operation Overlord is what we know popular as D-Day, June 6, 1944. I remember that for a number of reasons. Well, one is I like history, but the second is it's also my closest friend's birthday. Also a community college graduate, went on to Columbia University and became some kind of dean or something at the New York University school system. So we're both products of the community college, but that's his birthday. Not 1944, but June 6th. And so it's funny because it was a real question about whether this amphibious assault on these major beaches along the French coast would be successful. And many men died. There's no question about it. But Eisenhower, Ike, who later becomes president for 2 terms, is so skeptical himself about whether or not this plan is going to be something they can actually pull off that he actually has 2 speeches prepared for after the invasion, one of conciliation and regret and hopefully remotivating, I guess, the nation, and the other to celebrate the victory. And it was successful, and ultimately the end of the war's beginning really after D-Day, and then the long slog back into Germany. We know it doesn't go smooth or easy, but like any major war, it takes some time. And there was a huge counteroffensive called at the Battle of the Bulge, where Germany musters up everything they have, and they send these divisions out at Battle of the Bulge, and they nearly pulled it off. But the Germans too weakened by then. And then basically we have these conferences afterwards, where how Germany is going to be divided up between the major powers, and not only with Germany as a whole, but also Berlin, which is very complicated, which will come later chapters. We'll talk about the Berlin airlift, because the Cold War is going to start almost as soon as World War II ends. And then we know the Japanese war in America, it was a very slow slog. We lose the Philippine Islands, but we regain them. I'm not going to get into all the military battles, but the Japanese couldn't keep up their war production effort. We know Russia was supposed to promise, as a result of the ending of the war in Europe, VE Day, victory in Europe. I collect newspapers. I used to collect newspapers from back then. My father did not serve in World War II. He served in the Korean War, but he was a teenager in World War II. And he always talked about the history of it, and he collected a lot of stuff, memorabilia. A lot of the political buttons I have are from my dad during that era. And he talked about how people literally did. They celebrated in the streets all over the place, because he said it was so unusual to see somebody, a young male especially, women too, we'll get into that in a second, that participated in the war. If you were healthy, you participated in the military, and if you weren't healthy, you participated in other civilian roles to help support the war effort. It was a real congealing of the nationalism in our country during that era. And the victory over Europe was hugely celebrated. The death of Hitler, he committed suicide in his bunker shortly before the Soviets first captured the city, and then later the Europeans, or the Americans and Europeans, came in. 500,000 Americans died, in Japan. And the technique there finally to focus on that attention was island hopping. It worked out to be a very good strategy, but what they would do is, because the Japanese fought, they didn't have a conception of surrender. Surrender was dishonorable. And so the slog was very difficult. The battles of Iwo Jima, and thinking of some of the other ones that were unbelievably challenging, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, these people would fight right to the very end, and they'd rather die than surrender. And the difficulty was what kind of strategy. So they decided not to go for necessarily some of the more structurally defended islands that the Japanese control, but the island hop to go to the smaller ones where still an airfield could be supported and military support could be so strategically developed, and just island hop and basically squeeze them out. And that was going to become very successful. And now, after Okinawa's taken, we're ready to go into mainland Japan. But there was a lot of theories at the time that said it's going to cost millions of American lives, and probably millions of Japanese civilian lives as well. And they said, well, what can we do to curtail it? They won't surrender. Even though the writing was on the wall, they're going to lose the war, but they're not going to lose it without a fight. Thus, the creation, which was largely spurred because there was concern that German scientists were developing the atomic or nuclear weapons, or atomic weapons, I think they call them. I'm not a scientist. I know there's a distinction, but I'm not sure quite what it is. And they developed the Manhattan Project, and we developed the atomic bomb, and they initially blew off 3 of them here somewhere in American territory. One was called Trinity, the other is Fat Man, and the other is Little Boy. And then with the successful detonation of those, finally I heard I don't know if this is true, there was some warning sent to Japan, but we always warn our enemies that we're going to kick butt if you don't surrender. They didn't surrender, and so we let off 2. The first was, I believe, Nagasaki, and I think the second is Hiroshima. I don't know what the order was. Let's see. Yeah, Fat Man and Little Boy were built and detonated over 2 Japanese cities. Hiroshima was hit on August 6th. Nagasaki is August 9th, and they actually dropped Fat Man and Little Boy on them. The previous one, Trinity, was blown up in New Mexico just to see if it would work. And Hirohito, the Japanese emperor, signs documents of surrender, unconditional surrender aboard the USS Missouri. There's a lot of famous pictures of that. And there's an excellent history, I think a real humanitarian history in what the U.S. does under the Marshall Plan, not only in Japan, but also in occupied Germany as well, to bring that country back into civility and into economic success. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The U.S. soldiers experienced 60,000 American soldiers lost their life. That's just sailors, I should say. We know most people that were A1, fit for service. Those of you that are a fan of It's a Wonderful Life, my favorite movie. George Bailey couldn't go because he had a hearing impairment, so he couldn't serve, but he had to be what? It's a volunteer back in the civil patrol, whatever the heck that was, back in doing rubber drives and steel drives and things like that. Everybody was I shouldn't say everybody, the great amount of American citizens that were involved in the war effort outside of the military was tremendous. But if you weren't 1A, fit for service, you'd serve in some other capacity, because people still had to work in factories and things like that. But there was such a shortage because the economic boom in the industrial boom of war required many other employment. And there was basically there was a need, there was always gaps there, and a lot of women entered the workforce in traditional roles that were held by men. And we know African Americans, there was a huge part of the migration sometimes called the Great Migration. It started earlier than World War One, it actually did start earlier than World War One, but in World War Two there was a huge swelling, if you will, of the migration of African Americans from southern agrarian communities to northern cities and western cities that supported industrial work positions. They didn't always get them. There was a lot of discrimination, but the discrimination was so great that FDR didn't want to take a lot of action on racial discrimination because it feared his allegiance of Southern Democrats, and his political agenda did finally sign an executive order that anything to do with federal contracts for the military could not discriminate based upon race. 60,000 sailors. Talking about the Air Force wasn't the Air Force in World War II. It was called the Army Air Force, which is the subsection Army. Tens of thousands of airmen lost their lives. What's interesting about the war in Japan that was a little bit different than that in Europe was the gross atrocities that the Japanese conducted. The book doesn't get into great detail, but it was quite significant. If you go to the occupation of the Philippine Islands and the death march called the Bataan March, they made American soldiers that surrendered because they realized they were going to lose. I don't know how many miles was it exactly, but hundreds of or unbelievable heat without food or water, and many of them died in the process. The wartime economy, and this is the thing that FDR gets a lot of credit for all of his plans during the after the crash, the market crash, and the economy goes into deep depression. All of the WPA work projects, the agricultural projects, all these other pieces of legislation, Social Security Administration, things of that nature, minimum wage, National Labor Relations, all these things did stop the slide of the depression. It did start pushing it back. There was economic recovery occurring, but the unemployment rate was still huge, and America was still in at least a recession. World War II changed all that. Booming economy. Never before the output was so incredible. And it says economies win wars no less than militaries. In the United States did draft the economy into the war effort. And I'll probably put it on that next quiz. The war doubled all federal spending in all American history up to that point, just in World War II. All federal budget spending doubled throughout the entire American history. It's really remarkable. And of course, during that period of time, if you like cultural history, because it was geared towards war, consumers suffered in the sense that they couldn't get appliances or automobiles or other products because it was all going to the war effort, and things had to be rationed. Meat had to be rationed. Certain food supplies besides meat also had to be rationed. Gasoline was rationed. And my grandfather's car that I owned for a little bit of time before I hit a telephone pole down the end of this very road that I'm living on now, which is ironic, and totaled it. He kept his old ration card for gas. It was just a letter, and it corresponded to something that, that day of the week, if you had the letter A or B or C, you could go and get gas at the gas station. And my grandfather, who lost actually several of his brothers in World War II, kept all the little symbols of World War II surrounded. He's a collector too. And he used to keep that on that car. And unfortunately, like I said, I totaled that Chevy Sevelle in a telephone pole. But I always wondered about what was that thing I asked my grandfather when I was using the car. At the time I was 20. He was dead, but when he was alive, I remember him driving a car, and I always asked him, what was that symbol down there? He goes, oh, that's my ration card, so I know when to get gas. And he was kind of a wise guy, so I didn't know what it meant. So my father had to explain it to me that there was rationing during the war. And like if anybody ever says, I have a 1943 such and such a car, I'm always skeptical of that because there wasn't a lot of consumer cars being made for the consumer. All the used cars had to basically be what kept American consumers transported, because it would all into military trucks and vehicles and jeeps and things of that nature to support the war effort. Consumer choice was foreclosed. Americans received rationing cards. Goods such as gasoline, coffee, meat, cheese, butter, processed food, firewood, and sugar could not be purchased without these cards. Really amazing. The housing industry was shut down. No new houses were being built during this period of time, and cities became overcrowded. By the wartime economy boom, the Roosevelt administration urged citizens to save their earnings and buy war bonds. That was a big deal. And again, going back to my favorite movie, It's a Wonderful Life, when the war breaks out, what did George Bailey do? Because he couldn't go to war, he went out with the other people like Mr. Gower, who was an elderly pharmacist, and other people that were popular in the community, go out and sell war bonds. Because not only did it help you save your money, it actually gave money to the government for purposes of what? For funding the war. And it was a hugely popular and successful effort. And although I don't collect them in these buttons up here, I do have a lot of them. Eventually I put them in a shadow box somewhere. There were buttons being worn by many people, basically urging other people to buy war bonds or participate in war bond purchasing, because you get your money back with interest. It's on the full faith and credit of the government, and war bonds were very, very successful. And again, Roosevelt did get forced to pass Executive Order 8802, the Fair Employment Practice in Defense Industries, which tried to end racial discrimination in employment contracts for African Americans and other racial groups as well. We also know that Mexican migrants were brought in to work in the agricultural fields under a program during this period of time as well that worked right up into the 1960s. It was so significant. Women in World War II, we know Rosie the Riveter. We've heard all those stories. Women stepped up in many, not only in military service, direct military, especially the WAC Corps, and there wasn't direct military participation, but certainly in support services that are essential, nursing corps, in other administrative tasks, and I am probably not putting the right words to it to give it the proper credit that it deserves, but the effort was universal between all races, all sexes, and without the different groups participating, it probably wouldn't be successful. Over 350,000 women served in the all-female units of the military branches. That's just the military branches. They also served in things like the USO, the Red Cross. They staffed many other aspects of American industry where they historically would not be employed. They were working as tin knockers and machinists and all these other kinds of things to support the war effort. And ironically, they get the short shift, if you will, because when the men come home, women were expected to walk away from those jobs, and many of them did, whether by just acknowledging that's what they maybe think they should do, or basically being forced out of the positions. There wasn't a lot of protection for employment at that period of time. Not in the same way. Yeah, it says here, the nation that beckoned and called for the assistance of millions of women during the 4-year crisis hardly stood ready to accommodate the post-war needs and demands of women. Basically, women were called for help, and then when the time ends, they were cast off into the shadows from their very important roles during World War II. And we know race, again, a mixed bag. African Americans volunteered and were also drafted in the military service, and they served admirably many different military branches, but they were often segregated, often given menial tasks. And when they were put into conflict, they were put into conflict in their own individual units and not integrated units. That changed in 1948. And we know some of the successes, and I think that's the argument even in the Civil War. If African Americans says we're going to fight for the country, we're going to show the country we can do it, maybe people will get respect for us on equal footings. And one of them is the Tuskegee Airmen. These fighter pilots often escorted bomber groups all over Europe during this era, and they were so good and so adept at what they're doing. They were often requested by all white bombing units to be their escorts during this period of time, and giving a lot of credence to the fact that they are equal and they should be treated equal, and they have skin in the game, and they certainly should be treated with respect. And I think some of the arguments for civil liberties and civil rights being equally applied across the spectrum is showing that they have just as much commitment and patriotism as anybody else, and have risked the same costs and effort into the nation's survival, that they should reap the benefits of it as well. And we know things like the NAACP, started by actually Caucasians, but taken over and primarily, being run by African Americans since that era, the early advent of it as a abolitionist group. But the group grew tenfold, from 50,000 to 500,000 people, and different groups got together to promote racial equity, and it didn't get nearly the success we wanted to have. The civil rights movement is still going on today, but we know the war helped at least identify the need to correct racial injustice. But ironically, it also created some racial injustice. When the Great Migration occurred, many African Americans moved from southern agrarian areas, and the places they moved to often didn't invite them with open arms. In fact, race riots broke out in Detroit. I think 25 African Americans were killed, nine white people in the several days of rioting in 1943. So our history of racial intolerance and racial advancement and successes has always been mixed and often inconsistent, for lack of a better way of saying it. We know during this period of time there was some terrible things that the American government did. Probably in hindsight, we look upon it hopefully negatively, and hopefully the government would look at it negatively. But during the era, because of fear, the war hysteria, we locked up over 110,000 Japanese Americans, 70,000 of which were actually American citizens. The others were here legally; they were not illegal aliens. We locked them up if they were determined to be in what we call certain risk zones, but 2/3 of the nations were considered, 2/3 of our national land space was considered to be a risk zone, and they were put in internment camps for pretty much the period of the war, without any proof of any sedition or disloyalty to the country. Really, really sad part of history. And FDR signed that executive order based upon advice of military leaders. And the Constitution challenge to that, which did occur, a case called Karamatsu, I wrote a paper about it, was unsuccessful. People say, well, that's unconstitutional. I agree, but the court didn't. The court said 6-3 that the military and governmental regulation of putting people in internment camps during the period of war was a valid executive order by the president and was supported by the needs of the nation to keep national security. I think most of us look back. In fact, Ronald Reagan signed a law paying reparations to Japanese Americans and their families that were still alive or had relatives that lost businesses and economic harm, because when they were interred, they often lost their homes and their businesses because they couldn't continue to run them or maintain them during their periods of internment. It's amazing that these people didn't rebel in any way, not rebel against their nation, but rebel against basically being incarcerated unjustly. And a really sad part of American history. A lot of people don't realize it, but Germans, 10,000 German Americans and a much smaller group of Italian Americans were also put into some types of internment camps during this period of war. If you really study the racial fears of World War II, Joe DiMaggio, one of the great American baseball heroes in 1956, well, when he was younger, his father was his father was a fisherman, and he was banned from going to the wharves for a period of time because he was an Italian immigrant, and there was anti-Italian sentiment, fear of what Italians would do. Are they going to be loyal to the Italian nation, or are they going to be loyal to the United States? And that was a real crisis. It was most significantly against Japanese Americans because most of the Germans and the Italians actually were given a process of hearings to prove their allegiance to the United States. And if the government couldn't substantiate some kind of valid fear, if you will, some kind of real, genuine desire to undermine the war effort, they usually were set free. Really sad. George Takei, the guy from Star Trek, as a child, he actually spent time in the Japanese internment camps on the West Coast in California. But my favorite quote, because I studied it a lot, from one of them, because the argument, they actually had propaganda films out talking about how we're putting these people on these beautiful campuses for their own protection. And one of the people that were interned was saying, well, if it's for our own protection, why are all the machine gun nests up in these watchtowers all pointed into the camp where we're staying, as opposed to being pointed out to whatever's threatening us? It was clearly they were being incarcerated for a period of time because they were perceived to be a threat. I think it's a sad part of American history. We know there was a Holocaust during the journey. A lot of people say, well, why didn't we get involved? Why don't we do more about the Holocaust? Part of it was the American intelligence didn't believe it was nearly as significant as it was. And secondly, there was just this belief we're not going to enter into war, a foreign war, based upon what Hitler's doing to a religious or ethnic minority. It's just too much to risk to do it. It's really sad, but there was a lot of other sad parts of the history. I think the saddest, in terms of a very narrow story, is the story of the German ship, the St. Louis. Ship full, 9,000 Jewish refugees. Started off going to Cuba. Cuba wouldn't take them. Goes to the United States. We won't take them as refugees. They have to go through the process of applying, and they have to get in line like everybody else, is what we said. The ship goes up to Canada. Canada won't take them. So where do they go? They go back to Germany. And I don't know, several hundred at least end up dying in concentration camps as a result of that. So there's some failings in this process. I mean, hindsight's a beautiful thing, but I don't know, if we go back in time, maybe we would have done something very, very different and maybe acted much more quickly during this period of time. But anti-Jewish sentiment was alive and well during this period of time in America and the United States. And then there was a push to create increasing immigration for Jewish people in 1938, 1939, and U.S. Congress debated something called the Wagner-Rogers Bill to allow 20,000 Jewish German children into the United States. And First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt endorsed it, but the president laid silent on it. It just didn't. He thought there was too much political risk in it, and the bill was opposed roughly by 2/3 of the American public. It's a political question. 2/3 of the American public don't want it. Presidents don't support it or can't support it. And the bill was defeated. And that's why historians speculate that Roosevelt was anxious to protect the New Deal, and his rearmament program was unwilling to expend political capital to protect foreign groups. Sad part of history. And then the post-war era. The question is, Roosevelt called it the policemen of the world now. It's going to be the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. Well, China's going to fall apart pretty quickly. But there was a new push to create another League of Nations, which later becomes the United Nations. And we do join this one. The problem with the United Nations is there's some clauses in there for the main groups, the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France. And I don't know if there's another one have this power within the Security Council to basically veto anything that comes through there. So it's a bit of a paper tiger. I'm all favor it. When I was a kid growing up, I always thought the UN should kind of rule the world, but the problem is you give up certain sovereignty, certain power if you give the power to this entity that's world driven, and no nation really wants to do that. And because of that, it becomes much more of it's a very weakened organization with good intentions, for lack of a better way of saying it. But the UN charter does get done during this period of time. The GI Bill, got to give this guy credit. I like to say his name, William Atherton, my father loved the GI Bill. He didn't get it from World War II. He got it from the Korean War. It benefited him as well. The GI Bill basically educated more everyday Americans than any other process in the history of the United States. And because not only did it pay for your tuition, but you often got a stipend. If you came back and you were honorably discharged, you had to be honorably discharged. GI Bill also helped with housing, which is called the Veterans Loan. To this day, we still have that portion of the GI Bill. If you're honorably discharged, you may be eligible for a Veterans Loan, and you still have to pay it back and you still have to pay interest. But what makes the veteran loan popular, it's the eligibility is much easier to get the loan, and secondly, there's no down payment, so you can have like a buck or no money at all, and you might be able to be eligible to get a veterans loan. And that's the difficulty a lot of people, Americans, trying to buy their first home, is how do I come up with this deposit of 10 or 20% to get a home? It's nearly impossible. That's what the GI Bill alleviated in the Veterans Administration's access to veteran loans. And so the good news is that was very helpful to the economy. All these GIs didn't come back. They were also eligible for a year of unemployment. They didn't come back and basically shake up the economy by having to need jobs. All these men that came, men, women, and others that came back to work in private industry had alternative routes and a support system to keep the economy going. And the post-war economy does very, very well. The GI Bill sparked a boom in higher education. Still does. That's pretty much where I'm going to leave off. The Great War, the greatest generation, people argue. I'm not so sure about that, maybe because I'm not a part of it. But sometimes an event like World War II coalesces an ideology and a philosophy and a connection between a generation that really can't be matched. And that was certainly the World War II did that to many, many people. I'll close with that. I go on long too long. Read the book. It's excellent. Otherwise, I'll put up another one of those little mini quizzes. And World War II has to be a big part of your final exam. And it's all there in the book. I only test from the book. So be well.